Hey everyone, I'm Steve from gamersnexus.net, and we're back for another Ask GN episode. Some really good questions this week, and a couple that were pretty detailed, and I'm not getting to here, but I replied to at least one of them because I want to do a full feature, article, video, everything on that question in particular. I want to do more than just breeze through it on an Ask GN episode. But let's go through some of the good questions for this week, and of course, if I didn't get yours, please post it again below, and I'll see what I can do about the next episode. The first one is from Dinxsy, who says, I have a short question, if you could cover it. Is there any risk to having hard drives placed in a vertical position? Any known issues of skips, failures, reading data that you have come across? This is actually a really good question, and I'm a fan of this question because vertically mounting hard drives, if you think about it, seems like it could potentially be against spec. So a hard drive in a traditional use case, you kind of think of it as sitting like this in a desktop rig or something like that. And a hard drive, as you all likely know, has moving parts. It has spinning platters. Some of them have 3, some have 5, some have 1. And those are little metal discs that spin very rapidly in a circle. So normally 5,400 revolutions per minute or 7,200 or something like that. And the traditional point of failure for hard drives is the very way that they operate. It's the it's the mechanism through which they spin. So because you have a spinning platter at several thousand RPM, and you have a header, which effectively acts like a header on like a record player, you have a header that's trying to read a very precise point on that platter. Just like with a compact disc, although that uses lasers, you're reading a very precise ring in the disc around the center. So it requires a lot of accuracy, it requires high speed, it requires precision to make sure you're not missing the data and hitting the wrong point on the drive, which causes all kinds of errors, reading errors, check errors, stuff like that. And drivers fail a lot. They often do the click of death, as it is known. And the click of death starts happening when the drive ages, and things like the platter will start wobbling in its rotation, or the header will just really not move quick enough to access the data. So hard drives are very interesting mechanically and technologically because of the way they operate. I'm very interested in the topic. We can do more on that later. But answering this question specifically, if you look at the specs from all of the major manufacturers, including some of the defunct ones like Maxtor, WD, Maxtor, Samsung, HGST, and Hitachi, which has been consumed, or HGST has been consumed by WD. But all of these manufacturers state very clearly that their drives will function across all 6 axes. So you can mount it in any direction. It's got 6-axis functionality, and the drive will not care. So you would think that gravity would have an impact on the vertical revolution of a disk, because it's applying more force in ways that would not be applied when it's like this. So you would think that's a problem, but all of the manufacturers insist that it is not in their spec sheets, and these are even stretching to enterprise drives. So this is an important point. If you think about enterprise outside of the consumer world, hard drive racks for servers are normally mounted so the drives are vertical, and that's for space reasons. They can fit a lot more devices that way. They can build blades and more fine-tuned configurations for their clients. So the drives kind of have to work vertically, and all the spec sheets say it's not a problem. There is one potential concern, but it's probably not a concern for any of us as gamers or system builders or enthusiasts. And the one concern is that you will generate more heat if it's mounted vertically, but I'm talking a very, very small amount of extra heat, and hard drives don't get too hot to begin with. And that is because the platters dissipate heat best when they're mounted horizontally. Heat rises from the surface, and the enclosure for the hard drive, for the platters, is designed in a way that allows the heat to escape more readily through the big metal plate on the top and get out that way. So that is the one tiny concern. But for our audience, for you guys, for me personally, it's really not something that's worth us worrying about, unless you're in some sort of enterprise configuration. Then you really should not be talking to YouTube about that. You should be consulting experts for multi-million-dollar enterprise configurations. But so that is the deal with that. Next question, Let's Go Iowa. Oh, actually, I remember this name previously. Let's Go Iowa says, hey Steve, on the topic of degradation, talking about PSU degradation for the previous episode, How well do older graphics cards hold up over time? Have you noticed any particular trends one way or another with a certain model? And then goes on to say, I think the long lifespan of the GTX 8800 and AMD's 7970 were, I guess he's saying, were good, while the 580 seems left by the wayside in comparison. What traits lead to a long GPU service life? Another good question. I would agree that the 580 has not aged well. I actually had one and used it for a number of years, and it's really not holding up that well at this point, which it's kind of surprising because actually in this example you're talking about the 8800, I had one of those as well, and that held up crazy well. So a couple things here. When we're talking about how things hold up, there's different things that can mean. With FPS, that is going to be largely dictated by the environment of the game development atmosphere currently. So when the 8800 came out, it was the top of its class. The only game really pushing it was Crysis 1. And this is, I don't remember if it was 2007, 2008, somewhere in that area. Maybe as not as late as 2009, 7 or 8. And games did not really get a whole lot more intensive after Crysis 1 for quite a while. So the thing we're talking about with FPS metrics in terms of degradation is more dependent on the game space and the driver space than it is on the architecture of the GPU, because the architecture of the GPU is always going to be limited by some technological fab process or similar engineering challenge. But the way game engines utilize those cards, the way APIs utilize those cards with DX12, and back then it would have been probably DX10, maybe going into 11 eventually, that changes how long they will last in terms of FPS. So, and that's going to happen again with DX12 coming up. But then we look at other topics outside of FPS, and those are going to be things like thermals. So how well does the GPU itself hold up under long service life, as you're asking? And the answer to that is going to depend on how the heatsink is designed. So you want to look at things like the compound used. I talked about this in a recent video. Certain types of compound will decay over time, and some metal compounds really don't necessarily hold up too well over time. You want something like ceramic or some non-conductive compound for long service life. And then other things like the thermal pads used to hold the heatsink to the VRMs, to the VRAM, and all of those very critical power management or memory management items. If you don't have a high-end thermal pad on there and a high-end heatsink design, or when I say high-end, I just mean quality, then yeah, it's going to age faster. And the way it ages faster is from thermals. So if the GPU is running at 90 Celsius, as one of the commenters pointed out in the video, or in the reply to the question here, if it's running at 90 Celsius for its whole life, it's not going to have a long life. And you can replace the compound, the heatsink, all that stuff, but it's still getting damaged over time. And silicon does actually like heat a little bit, but not that much heat. So you'll want to target a lower temperature as low as possible, kind of get a case that's cooler, build the system around it, maybe even go with a closed loop, AIO, CLC or something on there. But if the thermals are lower, it'll last forever. I mean, it's not going to really have a problem, because the thing that happens with thermals is as it gets hotter, the compound cracks, the heat pads lift up off the surface and get some separation, so then they're not doing anything anymore, and then the heatsink has no contact with the VRM or the VRAM. And another item to look at is bearings. So fan bearings will wear out over time. And a double ball bearing setup, for example, has a pretty long service life. They're normally 40, 50,000 hours, something like that. So that's a number of years of 24/7. And then you look at things like the driver support. Going back to FPS, driver support matters because it dictates, how well does the card hold up for new games. You look at NVIDIA's recent 700 series drivers against their 900 series drivers. The 700 series video cards sort of fell off the cliff as the 900 series was ramping up, and that's because driver support was less emphasized or just not done correctly. So that's something to look at as well. That's part of why the 580 is now basically useless, and the 8800, because they're just not supported and tuned for anymore. So those are all different things to consider. But at the end of the day, it is thermals. I'm not going to really harp on one brand or another here. But some thermal designs for GPUs are better than others. That's all the AIBs, the add-in board partners, actually do, is thermal design. So you'll want to buy one that's a good design. Silence does matter, but don't go full silence if you're going to run this a long service life, because you want it to actually stay cool as much as possible. Next question, Homer Thompson, who has also posted before, asks, Steve, can a budget motherboard, e.g. H81, limit GPU overclocking versus what pairing with a higher end board, the Z97, with cleaner power delivery might be capable of? I wonder because the GPU can pull 75 watts through the PCIe slot. So, and says, I love the channel site, thank you. So, this is a good question. As many of you know, the H-series chipsets will limit CPU overclocking, and actually to the point that you can't even do it, depending on which generation we're talking. So that is actually a thing that happens, and they also normally have weaker VRMs, so it's fewer phases, lower grade chokes or caps, not all of them, but a lot of them. And this limits the efficacy of the power management. So that's why you don't want to overclock and why you can't overclock on those chipsets. Now with GPU overclocking, what you care about is going to be the VRM on the GPU, not necessarily the motherboard. So the motherboard does matter. It still manages power delivery to the GPU. And if you look at high-end motherboards, you'll see that some of them are built for GPU overclocking. So an example would be, we've got an X99 EVGA board in the lab. I think it's a classified board, or maybe FTW. So it's a high-end X99 board. And that has an extra pinout on the board for the GPU. So we can plug another 6 power pins from the PCIe header from the power supply into the board, and that gets managed and delivered to the GPU if you're doing any kind of extreme overclock. Some boards do this through Molex 4-pin connectors. So yes, the board can impact GPU overclocking, but we're talking at the sort of extreme class here. If you're doing serious overclocking, then you will want that extra power, but a lot of GPUs, you'll need to custom tune the BIOS to even get to the point where you can accept the power to prove any difference. So boards do impact it, but not terribly so. If you have an H81 board, or whatever, something similar, H110, whatever, one of those, then the limitation is going to be primarily by the GPU's VRM itself and your power supply's grade of cleanliness for the power delivered. And you can probably get a couple hundred megahertz out, no problem. It will get hotter though, so the chipset, which is located beneath the GPU, if it's not really cooled adequately on a lower end board, the chipset can start overheating, and that'll cause I/O problems and stuff like that. So hopefully that gives sort of an answer to the question. I guess the short form is that yes, a motherboard can impact GPU overclocking, but not to a crazy extent. It can, but we're talking extreme overclockers here, not kind of the average user who just wants 200 extra megahertz. Next question. Hi Steve, this is from Ill2 Xbox. Hi Steve, really liking these Ask a GM videos. They're very informative. I have a question about improving airflow, reducing noise in my system, and then the question goes on for a good bit there, talking about different items in the scenario. So reducing noise, the best thing to do is fans first. So you can, just getting a liquid cooler, first of all, does not make your system quieter. It depends on the liquid cooler. A lot of radiator fans are pretty loud. So the first thing to look out for is PWM fans, and those are indicated by a 4-pin header on the fan cable, and that needs to be plugged into a 4-pin header on the motherboard. PWM fans can be controlled depending on need by thermals that the CPU often dictates. So if you're in a low thermal environment, it'll run them at a lower RPM. They're quieter that way. So that's one thing that can help a lot. Now, not all fans are made equal either. So if you have a bunch of 120 millimeter fans, it's important to look at the bearing type. Some bearings are louder than others. Some age more poorly than others. Sleeve bearings, for example, do not age very well. Ball bearings age pretty darn well, but towards the end of their life, and we're talking 40 or 50,000 hours here, toward the end of their life, they start squealing from the grease drying up. So that's another thing to look out for if you have an older system is what kind of bearings in there. And if you get some kind of fluid dynamic or hydro bearing, those should be quieter in terms of the bearing noise, but you still need to make sure the RPM is lower. And RPM is really what dictates a lot of the noise, as is the blade design. The blade design will impact the turbulence in terms of the air being pushed into the system, how much is getting trapped between the blades on the intake. And let's see, other than that, probably one of the major things to do would be increase fan size where possible. And again, not all are made equal, but the larger the fan, the slower it can spin and still move the same amount of air as a smaller fan. So you'll want to eliminate like 80 millimeter fans in SFF builds. You want to eliminate 120 where possible. And the next thing to do is get some kind of vibration damping setup so that you can get like rubber sort of glue vibration absorption systems that you just attach to your hard drives and to fans between normally the rear fan and the chassis. That'll reduce vibrational noise. You can also get a foam that is applied to the paneling, the side panels. A lot of cases ship with this now, but you can buy it separately from modding sites as well. And it's an adhesive, and you have the side panel, you stick the adhesive to it, and that will absorb, block, or deflect, depending on how it's designed, a certain amount of noise. Not a ton. It's better to go the fan route first and look for vibrational noises, and then probably look into CLCs or better air coolers. And that's the biggest item I think that I haven't mentioned yet, is your CPU cooler matters. That makes a lot of noise. So stock coolers are pretty loud. If you want a quieter setup, you could get something like the Be Quiet coolers. True to their name, they are very quiet. We use them on our test bench because they run basically 100% of the time behind me over my shoulder. So those are dead quiet, and they'll modulate the CPU fan based on load, which is really good because you don't want it spinning full speed all the time. It'll spin down and even almost stop sometimes when it's not necessary because the giant aluminum heatsink can do the job just fine when at idle. GPUs. You can buy a GPU like the Strix or the EVGA ACX coolers, stuff like that. The MSI gaming coolers. Those will spin down to 0 RPM when they're under 30 watts or less load. So Dota or League can generate a small enough load that your fans don't even need to turn on for the GPU. That makes it quieter. The power supply, after all of these items, if it's still too noisy, start looking at the power supply because those fans make noise too. And a bigger fan is better in this instance because it can spin slower. So they're normally 135 millimeters or 120, depending on what you're looking at. That's another place to look. Corsair makes pretty darn quiet power supplies, so does Be Quiet. NZXTs can be a little louder, but that's all sort of generalizations. Hopefully that helps. Let's do one more here very quickly, and I'll address this one probably in an upcoming full feature article, so we'll get back to this later. But question from Street Guru says, would you suggest an 860K with an R9 390 or an i5 4460 with an R9 380? So $70 plus $300, 860 plus 390, versus 180 plus $200, i5 plus 380. Which one do you think is better, relatively the same cost? This is pretty cool. So this is a good question because it is actually a real scenario where if we were building, that's something we'd think about. It kind of comes down to personal preference. I really like building with a stronger base platform like the CPU, the motherboard, and the power supply because things like the GPU and RAM are very easily upgraded later. So for this specific scenario, I would go with the i5 and the 380 because I would rather have a high-end board and CPU and just swap the GPU maybe a year from now when I have more money or something like that. So my thinking behind this, it's a couple things. One is Windows really does not like it when you change the motherboard and the CPU. If you're working on keys, then sometimes it won't let you. You have to call in and get another one, which Microsoft will often do, but that is a consideration that can increase your cost a hidden $100 if you have to reinstall the OS. But mostly it's just that if I don't want to reinstall my host setup in a year just to upgrade, then I would probably want a base platform that stays the same, static. So the CPU and the motherboard stay the same. The next thing is GPUs are really easy to upgrade. You don't have to do a lot. You just pull it out and put a new one in. With a CPU, you might have to change the motherboard. In the case of the 860K, that's a pretty good chance you're changing the motherboard because FM2 Plus only gets you so far right now. And that's another cost. And then with the CPU's actual performance, you really don't want to bottleneck something like a 390, which will happen on an 860K. You don't want to bottleneck that GPU for a whole year or whatever, however long you're waiting to upgrade. It's just kind of a wasted expense then. So those are the things to consider. I am a fan of building a stronger base platform and upgrading the more modular items later, if that answers that. But we'll run some benchmarks and do a thing on this because it's a fun question. I do have to get hardware from AMD though, and that is sometimes hard to do. So that's all for this video. Thanks for watching and submitting your questions. Post more below. Huge thanks to those of you who are Patreon backers. I think they're called patrons or whatever you however you wanna pronounce it. And I think we're up to maybe 30 now. It's getting there. It's really tremendously supportive, and I am appreciative, as is the rest of the team. So that's all for this time. Check back for more content throughout the week. Check the website for some good stuff on laptops, some new news items and things like that. I'm currently watching the focus box follow my head around on the camera. Anyway, that's all for this time. I will see you all next time.